The Steel type is one of, if not Pokemon's best type. Since it was introduced in Gen 2, Steel has been remarkably solid. Pun somewhat intended. In the best type series, Steel dominated nearly half of all the regions. And despite being one of the rarest types with only 66 species, easily more than a dozen of them could occupy the top tier of competitive battling at any given time. So what exactly makes Steel type so good? Let's break it down. As mentioned before, Steel was introduced in Gen 2, presumably as a part of Pokemon's movement to make Psychic not horribly overpowered. But can you really call it a nerf to Psychic specifically when Steel also initially resisted 11 of the 17 types? On top of that, they have immunity to one of the most important statuses in the game, Poison. You'll see why that's important later on. So since day one of Steel's existence, Steel has far and away been Pokemon's best defensive type. This is especially important in the competitive landscape where frequently switching Pokemon to get the upper hand is the norm. Oftentimes, if you have a Steel type to switch into, you can do so relatively safely to keep the momentum on your side. It also helps that, on average, fully evolved Steel types boast a massive base 122 physical defense stat, easily the highest average defense among all types. I would say that these babies are more solid than the Titanic, but that implies that something terrible might happen in the near future, so I'll hold off on that. Side note, this also makes them incredibly viable for Nuzlocke challenges where you'll need to switch out of risky situations. A good, high defense Steel type is one of the best tools around for keeping your teammates alive. But even offensively, Steel types are no slouch. Sure, they may have only directly beaten Ice and Rock types back in the day, nothing too noteworthy, but they still hit most types for neutral damage, and of the 4 types that resist Steel, being Electric, Fire, Water, and Steel itself, 3 of those 4 are weak to Ground-type moves. Luckily for Steel, Earthquake is an incredibly common move in most Steel types' arsenals, since they tend to be big and heavy. It's amazing how good their coverage can be just by running a Steel move and Earthquake alone. Unlike a lot of types, Steel may not have the luxury of having a lot of moves, but really just between Iron Head and Flash Cannon, neither of which are exclusive in the slightest, pretty much every Steel type with good offensive stats will have a reliable move to count on, at least as of Gen 4. But as you might imagine, the earliest top-tier contenders from Steel were utility Pokemon, Skarmory and Forretress. Skarmory, of course, was one of the best physical walls in Gen 2, and Forretress exceeded in the department of setting up spikes, and then... Forretress! Explosion! Gen 3 would see the same major players, but now add 2 incredible offensive powerhouses to that list, Jirachi and Metagross. Metagross has the aforementioned holy combination of Meteor Mash with a side of Earthquake and a large Coke. Jirachi, on the other hand, was a Happy Meal with all the toys inside. This video is not sponsored, by the way, this is just the analogy that I'm rolling with. It can play Setup with Calm Mind, Support with Wish, Hyper Offense with its incredible move pool, or just plain annoying with Serene Grace Body Slam. In fact, these 2 Pokemon were so centralizing in the meta that another Pokemon rose through the ranks as the Steel-type killer, Magneton, who also happened to be a Steel type itself. With the Magnet Pull ability, Magneton was excellent at trapping and disposing of annoying Skarmory walls, and with Thunder Wave, it was one of the few Pokemon capable of crippling Jirachi. But if you thought they were good back then, you ain't seen nothing yet, because Gen 4 would be one of Steel's best generations. With the introduction of Technician and Bullet Punch, Scizor would finally break into the top tier of competitive battling and stay there for most of the next 15 years. Empoleon would also be introduced as the first Water Steel type Pokemon, combining 2 of the best defensive types in the game. Magneton would get an upgrade to keep up with the competition as Magnezone was introduced, and Heatran would also join the party as another long-term player. All of these Pokemon covered vastly different niches, as it was apparent that Steel type was no longer the defensive 1 or 2 trick pony that it used to be. But even more significant than that, entry hazards would become incredibly common in this generation, thanks to the introduction of Stealth Rock and Toxic Spikes. Including regular spikes, Fortress could use all 3 of these hazards, Skarmory could use 2, and as for the rest, they need not worry, as Steel not only resists Stealth Rock, but is also immune to Toxic Spikes entirely. Remember earlier when I said that constant switching is a common tool in competitive battling? Well, in this new era where switching was no longer tax-free, Steel types felt almost no consequences from it. In fact, they flourished in it. And this only carried over into Gen 5, where 2 more incredible Pokemon would be introduced. Ferrothorn, a wall so sturdy and excellent it would make Donald Trump jealous, and Excadrill, who was so overpowering that for a bit he had to spend some jail time in Ubers. Competitive battling aside, Excadrill also happens to be one of the best Pokemon to use in the main campaign maybe ever introduced. thanks to its incredible type combination and vicious offensive move pool. Of course, what made it so good in competitive battling was the nature of the Gen 5 meta itself, which almost entirely revolved around Weather Wars, thanks to newly introduced hidden abilities giving Drought and Drizzle to unrestricted Pokemon like Ninetales and Politoed. This just made Tyranitar an even more popular counterpick since it already had Sandstream, which makes Excadrill even more threatening thanks to both of its abilities, Sand Rush and Sand Force. This pretty much led to Steel types striking an alliance with Ground and Rock to form a superpowered kingdom of their own. Gen 6 would bring the hammer down on the Weather Wars, but it would also nerf Steel by scrapping its resistances to Dark and Ghost. Because after 14 years, somebody at Game Freak finally said, hey, that doesn't make a lot of sense, I've never seen Steel stop a Ghost in real life. Gen 6 would also introduce a new player to the game, Fairy type, which would quickly become one of the most powerful types in the game, both in terms of the main story and the competitive scene. Of course, Steel would be the only type other than Poison with a greatly favorable matchup against Fairy. On paper, this may look like a net loss for Steel, it lost 2 resistances and gained 1, but this couldn't be any farther from the truth. Now Steel was in higher demand than ever to deal with the pesky new Fairies. Bisharp made the jump to top tier, Scizor and Metagross, 2 of Steel's very best, received Mega Evolutions, something incredibly beyond belief happened to Mawile, and Aegislash ended up being so good that it got banned. Partly because Steel Ghost boasts the most resistances of all type combinations with 12, but also because Aegislash has one of the most ridiculous abilities / signature moves ever made. Gen 7 ended up being mostly more of the same, Celesteela became an excellent tank, and Kartana is basically Ferrothorn if it had Aegislash's blade form. Nowadays in Gen 8, it seems like Steel's powerful presence has been slightly dialed back since many of the old fearsome fairy types have lost relevance, but they certainly are still there, ready to pounce. And that's just in the singles meta. If you're talking VGC, Zacian is still one of the most centralizing Pokemon around, being present in over 60% of teams at the moment. Granted, I think Zacian would have been incredibly broken even if it wasn't Steel type, but still, it can't hurt that it is. I think what's most remarkable about Steel types is that they've held up shockingly well through the years. I mean, look at Scizor, Skarmory, Jirachi, Magnezone, Heatran. These Pokemon have been around for ages, but even as Pokemon continuously power creep slowly upward, these guys are still more than viable. The only Steel types that come to mind that have drastically fallen off since their introductions are Metagross and Lucario. And honestly, if their Megas were still around, they'd still more than likely be top tier threats. And hey, these two are still more than good enough to use during any main story run. In general, the bar of quality for Steel types is just much higher than it is for most types. There's really only a handful of duds like regular Mawile, Probopass, and Wormadam Trash Form, and even the ones that aren't great in the competitive scene are still good for the main story or Nuzlocke like Steelix, Aggron, and Duraludon. It's just a generally useful type no matter what way you're choosing to play the game. So go on, use the Steel type, don't be shy. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to stay updated with new videos like this one. I'm sure there's lots of other types that we'll be discussing in the near future. And as always, a big shout out to my amazing channel members, including my newest one, my buddy Filippo Depot. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.